something a little bit different tonight. Rather than going in a chronological order, I thought we would start with the Isaiah covenant. So what we're going to do, we're going to come back to the burnt offering covenant in just a little bit. We're going to save that for the end because I think there will probably be the most discussion on that particular covenant. So what we're going to do, we're going to go to page 101 and start with the Isaiah covenant. And what's fascinating to me in the Isaiah covenant is that Yahweh really doesn't add anything new. He's really working off of the Abrahamic covenants and reaffirming all the promises that he had given to Abraham very early when Abraham came into the land. So Isaac is just being reaffirmed in that. One thing that's very interesting with Isaac, if you will remember at his birth, or rather at his weaning ceremony, Ishmael was disinherited for all intents purposes. And with that came the fact that Isaac was elevated to this position of being Abraham's only son, under legally, as far as inheritance was concerned, and being his firstborn son. So just remember that, keep that in mind as we go on, because as we come back to it later on, that is going to become very important when we look into the burnt offering covenant. So as we get into the Isaiah covenant, we find out that there are two customs that are established in Scripture, and I will say these are really nothing new. The two particular covenant, or rather customs, that I am referring to are the custom of the birthright and the blessing. The birthright is usually called primogeniture. It is the idea that my book keeps wanting to open up here. I'm going to put something on it. The birthright is where the firstborn receives a double portion. This custom honestly originated with Noah. So in Noah's time, he gives Shem a double portion. And we find that in Mesopotamia, this became a custom. And this custom really became binding law almost, because every firstborn son, usually in Mesopotamia, not so much in Egyptian society, but in Mesopotamian society, the firstborn would receive a double portion of land at the time of the father's death, or whenever the father decided to divide up the estate. We don't find that in Egypt. In Egypt, each son received a single portion. So you kind of see that in the lineages and in the history of the different patriarchs and their descendants. The other custom that you had was the blessing. And for those of us that have grown up in more of a Christian, with a Christian background, I think the idea of a blessing is really diluted, and it's been just kind of evolved into something that is not totally scriptural. So when I think of a blessing, at least before I started this, I thought of a blessing as peace, prosperity, good fortune, having no evil occurrent, no adversaries, peace on your land, wealth, health. I mean, what good does wealth do if you're not healthy enough to enjoy it? So exactly, Stephen writes that Mesopotamia was mainly Semitic, and that is absolutely correct. And that is why we see a lot of the Shem type of traditions within the Mesopotamian culture. So when we think of a blessing, coming back to the idea of blessing here, we think of something that is beneficial, something that ensures a good future. And while all of those are indeed part of a scriptural blessing, a specific scriptural blessing entails something more, something very specific. And that is the idea of leadership, rulership, and monarchy. So when Isaac receives the blessing from Abraham, and what is really established with Abraham is the right to rule. And this isn't just rulership of the Abrahamic clans. This is rulership of the entire world. Remember, it says that your mother's sons will bow down to you. And this whole idea that the world will be blessed through Isaac's seed, and then later through Jacob's seed, is the idea that this leadership comes not through, so, because Israel is the ruling entity. It doesn't come because Israel has this leadership. It doesn't come because Israel is the nation that has the king. Not at all. Instead, it comes because of the values and the constitution that is established in Torah. Now, if you guys have listened to my teachings on the biblical constitution, which I have that teaching on YouTube, I highly recommend that you watch it. I am actually working on a book that will expand that and show how closely related and how similar the United States Constitution and the biblical Torah Constitution are. It is absolutely amazing. Establishes division of power, constitutional monarchy, all these things that ensure liberty and righteousness and justice, because you can't have liberty if you have a sect of society that is not just and that is oppressing another sect of society. It will eventually disintegrate. And Dave Tyler brings up an excellent point regarding the blessing and Israel's leadership. Yahweh never changes. Yahweh stays the same. And this leadership that has been established in Abraham and in his seed is there for all eternity. And, you know, there is this idea that when we get into the specifics, and this is a little bit later on, we'll look at this a little bit in chapter 4, and we will definitely come back to it when we get into the testimony, which is the prophetic aspect of Israel's history and of her covenant. But when you look at the testimony, Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, you find that the blessing that Israel receives, because they have violated their covenant, this blessing is suspended. They lose this right to rule. They lose their power. They lose all the things that made them great. And if you'll remember, the things that made them great were always based on if you will. So if you will walk in my way, if you will follow my covenant, you know, my statutes, my judgments, obey my voice, all of those things are predicated on if. So it never comes by magic. It never comes by just believing. And it never comes by wishful thinking. It comes from society and this establishment of a society that actually walks in the way of Yahweh religiously, politically, and health. So it's really a holistic approach to a government and to a culture and a community, a society. So again, just to recap, a birthright was an inheritance of land. And for the firstborn, it was a double portion. All the other male descendants inherited a single portion. Sometimes daughters could inherit too. If you'll recall, Joshua gives a land inheritance to his daughter, and a land inheritance that included springs. So, but that was not always the case, because usually women married into a family and she would live on her husband's property and she would be part of that tribal community when she married. So the land heritage usually followed the man. Instead of a landed heritage, women usually received a dowry. Now, this was a very large portion of money that she could either A, contribute to her family with her husband, or she could keep it as a safety net should she ever have to leave her husband. So that was something that was established for her. So while men inherited land, women usually inherited wealth. Blessing, again, a scriptural blessing is a specific right to rule over a family clan or over the nations. So as we get into the other covenants, and that is really, you know, I do want to bring out one other thing, and that is the idea that Israel would be called in the name of Isaac. And I think, Stephen, you had texted me earlier today. I think you had a question regarding the name of Israel and prevailing in the way of Yahweh. You know, from what I see in Hosea, I do find that the name, you know, Israel is called in this name that means laughter, and called after that in Scripture. And there's this idea that the Isaac's blessing, you know, all the other patriarchs had something specific that they were giving, a specific land or a specific promise. And the specific thing that is established for Isaac is that the whole entire nation of Israel would be called in his name. And you find that when Jacob's name is changed to Israel, that it fulfills that promise. It fulfills that aspect of the Isaiah covenant. Let me catch some of these comments. All right, so I opened up a can of worms here. Stephen says, can a woman leave her husband? You know, there's nothing in Torah that prohibits it. You do have the Levite's wife, the Levite's concubine, who left her husband and went to her family, returned to her family. We really don't know. There aren't a lot of provisions. When you read other ancient Near Eastern texts, you find that women could leave. Women often didn't have a whole lot of rights. In most societies, they were not protected in any way. But you do not find anything in Torah that prohibits a woman from leaving her husband's house. The idea is that if the husband is doing what is right, he's taking care of the family, they're going to want to invest together and they're not going to want to leave. Okay, yes. Alejandra says that. Okay, yes. All right, so Chloe says, so Joseph's portion was not recompense for his troubles, and Reuben would have been given a double portion had he not sinned. Yes, that's a very good point. Had Reuben not sinned, he would have received the double portion. Now, this is a very interesting question, and we will get into it more in chapter 4. But yes, indeed, Joseph also received a double portion, but it was not taken out of Israel's inheritance. His double portion was given to him out of the Jordan region. So it was an extra portion that was added to it. Stephen points out that the dowry was also provision in case she became a widow. Excellent point. It really was. You know, if you guys are familiar with the Jane Austen movies, which really follow this idea of primogeniture, you find that in 17th, 18th century England, that when a man died, the estate went to his nearest male relative, and the woman had no protection whatsoever. That is not the case in Torah. In Torah, the woman was protected, and she could not lose her land, her husband's inheritance whatsoever. She was allowed to live on the land either until her natural death, or she was allowed to acquire children through a near relative. So incredible protection for women, something that you don't find in any ancient Near Eastern society, and you didn't even find in modern times under English law. So I totally agree with you. The Torah provides a lot of protection for women. So going on now into the Isaiah covenant, you find that, and I'm on page 105, guys. I find that Yahweh again confirms the blessings of Abraham. Everything that has been said before is reiterated. There is not one contradiction. Nothing is rescinded. Everything is upheld. You also find that Yahweh confirms the birthright in this blessing, and he does it because Isaac obeyed. He also adds a condition, and we will get into this a little bit later, but we find that when Abraham had taken Isaac to Mount Moriah and offered him as a sacrifice, that act, as most sacrifices did, sealed a very specific covenant that we will look at in just a little bit. But that self-imprecating sacrifice at Mount Moriah really sealed the blessings for Isaac for his whole entire life. Stephen says the best example of Yosef's, Chad's daughters are even inherited land. Yes, very true. They inherited land as well. But the condition was that they could not have married outside their family and outside their lineage. And that was, again, to prevent inheritances from cross-inheriting, where you had jurisdiction here in the middle of another land. It really would become confusion if, for instance, say New York had a county or a piece of land it had jurisdiction on over in Pennsylvania. It would just become an administrative nightmare. Yes, do not despise the teaching of your mother. Yes, more mothers wish were quoted on a regular basis. So going on, we find that I want to really spend some time with Jacob. I really find that the Jacob and the Jacobic covenants are really almost an analogy for the entire nation of Israel. Jacob's life just seems to symbolize Israel's past 2,500 years, this struggle. You know what is right. You know what's been handed down to you. You have the history. You have the teachings. But yet you don't always do it. He cheats his brother, and it produces strife in the family because of this cheating that occurs. He's not always fair and honorable with his brother, and that produces a lot of tension within the family. You find that Jacob has to flee the land, something that his forefathers did not have to do. But coming back, let's look at Genesis 28 verses, I think this is going to be right around verse 15. I'm not sure. I'm working on page 107. Right before Jacob leaves the land, he is given a covenant. He is given a promise that Yahweh will be with him, that he will go with him, he will bless him. But notice what he says. He says that your seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and you shall be spread abroad to the east, to the west, to the north, and to the south. And in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Now again, remember, this idea of blessing always entails and encompasses the idea that Jacob's seed will rule not just the land of Israel. My daughter just walked in. Hey, honey, love you. She just walked in from college. But not only would Israel's seed inherit the land of Israel, but that this blessing of rulership would be for other nations, and that it would bless other nations outside of Israel. So you find that, Jacob, he's one person. How is he going to be spread to the east, the west, the north, and the south? Even during the lifetime of his children, they came from Mesopotamia, they came into the land of Israel, and then they go down to Egypt, and then they come back. There really is not a lot of this north. I mean, they don't really go north, south, east, and west. So you find that this prophecy is really established for Israel's future, for the future of the entire people of Israel, because it is the seed that this is promised to, and that they will be spread abroad. And how is it, let me ask you this, how is it that the spreading of Israel into all nations becomes a blessing? How does taking Israel off the land of Israel for their own sins and sending them into the diaspora, sending them to Babylon, sending them to Assyria, and their later migrations, how does that bless the families and the nations of the earth? So I'm going to wait a few minutes for your comments on this. I'm going to go ahead and catch Billy's comment. He says, how and from whom did Esau get the birthright? He had it to use as payment for lentils. Well, Esau was actually born with the birthright. So the birthright was Esau's, and it was his right. It was based on his birth, because he was technically born a few minutes before Jacob. So he had the right to sell it. That was something that you could do. So he sells his birthright to Jacob, something that was totally legal, but on Jacob's part was not necessarily the most honorable thing to do. And you find that it put a wedge between the brothers. There was some hostility there for how it all went down. So yes, he did use it as payment, and I guess Esau was pretty hungry. When you read through the account of Esau, he does not strike you as someone who is always rational and calm. He kind of comes across as somebody who is very rash and makes some impromptu decisions that are not always long-term and thinking for the future. So coming back to this idea of Israel being spread to the north, the south, and the east, and the west, how do they bless the nations? You find that they take this idea of a liberty, of having rights under a law, of not being persecuted, and the idea that everyone is equally under the law, that the law isn't just for the privileged, it isn't just for the select few. It is for the entire nation, and all benefit from it when society follows this righteous standard. So you find that this idea is planted, and you know, this idea grows, and then there's conflict, and there's really this struggle for survival, for self-survival throughout the diaspora, until you finally come and you begin with the Magna Carta and this struggle for liberty that continues throughout English history and throughout European history, and really culminates with America, where it's finally established. And you see this incredible blessing. Bethel Watt says the distribution of Yahovah into all the nations. Exactly, exactly. And by, you know, it's really fascinating when you study the rise of Confucianism, of Taoism, and different ideas over in China and India. You find that some of these ideas are not too far off base from Torah, but you find that these ideas and these movements, they all occur within about 100 years after Israel has been disseminated into the nations. So you're always left wondering, what influence did Israel have? You know, what ideas and an exchange of ideas occurred from this people having Torah and being sent to other nations and interacting and sharing that blessing and those ideas with other cultures. So we also find, and to me this was fascinating, when I did my research, you know, I had always heard, you know, this idea of a biblical restoration was coming back to the land. I had no idea that there were so many prophecies that of taking Israel off the land and the promise of latter-day redemption. You know, Isaiah says, I will bring you your seed from the coast. I will gather you from the west. I will say to the north, give up, and to the south, keep not back. Bring my sons from afar and my daughters from the ends of the earth, everyone that is called by my name. So you find this idea throughout Scripture. And let me go even to the law, because written at the covenant, before Israel enters the land, is this idea that she would be scattered from the land when she rebelled against the covenant, and that she would be brought back. And in Deuteronomy 30, you hear there is this idea of Yahovah bringing Israel back to the land. I mean, this was before they had even entered the land. He says, I will remember your covenants, and I will reestablish the covenant with you. So Israel, before they went into the land, knew that if they obeyed, they would be taken off the land, and that they would be disseminated among the nations. But in the end, eventually, Yahovah would remember this covenant, and there would be this idea of restoration. Yes, very true, Dave. You say that they were in India and China as well. Very, very true. And yes, Israelite symbols displayed in Afghanistan. You know, you really find it everywhere. You find it in Egypt. You find it in Afghanistan. You find it in really more in the ideas that you find in China and India that were current, say, around 400 BCE. And then they kind of get infused with other religious movements. But, you know, you kind of lose Israel and the tracking of Israel as the Scythians come to power, and you really don't trace any of those migrations. It becomes very difficult. You know, what we will look at in about 2 weeks are the blessings of the 12 tribes. And when you see the characteristics that are prophesied for the tribes, you see a lot of those characteristics in a lot of the European nations. But just because those nations are perhaps the predominant heirs and the predominant lineages of those tribes does not discount the fact that their seed were at one time in other places, and that their seed is still in those nations. So Billy says, so Esau got the birthright from his mother. Actually, no. The birthright was always passed down from father to son. The birthright was something that if you were the firstborn son, whether you were Reuben or whether you were Shem, you were always born with that right of birthright. Now, with Noah, he establishes a custom where the firstborn receives a double portion. So you find that Semitic cultures follow this custom where the firstborn received this double portion. So this birthright was Esau's. He was born first. He was born before Jacob, so he had it. And he had it up until the time that he sold it to Jacob. From the moment he legally transferred that to Jacob, the birthright became Jacob's and he owned it. But it was something that every firstborn son was born with. Stephen points out that Abraham also sent most of his children to the east. Very good point. You know, this is something that when you read, at least, you know, in church school or in Sunday school or Sabbath school, whatever it is you attend, you never really hear, you know, the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say. And people don't realize that after Sarah died, Abraham remarried. Her name was Keturah. And when he died, or not, I'm sorry, before he died, as he grew older and his children became into their manhood, he gave them gifts of wealth and he sent them away to the east. And it's very fascinating that one of his sons that is sent away to the east, his name is Midian. And it's very possible that this Midian eventually became the nation of Midian, from which to which Moses fled when he was pursued by Pharaoh, and the land in which he stayed and he sojourned, marrying one of the daughters. And it's fascinating because when Israel comes out of Egypt, and Jethro, which would have been more of a title than an actual name, his real name was Reuel. When he meets Israel, this was Moses' father-in-law, when Reuel or Jethro meets Moses at Mount Sinai, he gives Moses this incredible counsel. And how did he know to give counsel that was in line with Torah? It says he's the priest of Midian. And if he was trained in the way of Yahweh by Abraham, if he was schooled in the way of Yahweh by Abraham, Midian would have grown up in that culture and that knowledge, and he would have shared it with his descendants and instilled it in his society. And David Tyler writes, I saw a stone stele in North Afghanistan that had Hebrew writings. That is fascinating. And didn't Simcha Jacobovici, didn't he do a documentary on the steles in Afghanistan? Yes, Afghanistan. Okay, Ghanaisia. So there are different documentaries that do indeed deal with these stones. I think Simca's is one of them, but I know that there's also other documentaries that deal with them as well. All right, I'm going to come back to some of these prophecies. You know, I've seen and I remember growing up when we saw all of these prophecies for Israel's latter-day restoration, that the idea was that it would occur during the Second Temple period, when Judah came back from Babylon, came back from Assyria, and came back to the land. But you know, there are things that are prophesied there that never happened. They have yet to occur, that Israel would never again be uprooted from the land. That's one of the prophecies. But guess what? Israel was again uprooted from the land. They were deported by Ptolemy. They were chased off the land by the Romans. So this prophecy has not yet been fulfilled. You find that, you know, let me just read one of these. This is Ezekiel 39, 27 through 29. He says, I have gathered them to their own land, and I will leave none of them anymore. Neither will I hide my face from them, for I have poured my spirit upon the whole house of Israel. This is something that hasn't happened yet. But again, it talks about this physically returning to the land. You know, Ezekiel 11:17, I will gather you from all nations and from all people. I will send you out of all countries from where you have been scattered and give you back the land of Israel. You know, when Israel returned in the 5th century, she returned from 1 or 2, maybe 3 nations. There really were these world empires. So it wasn't gathering Israel out of all nations at that particular point in time. So this is something that is future. This is something that has yet to occur, something that is the hope of Israel on many, many fronts. So I was surprised to see how many of these prophecies there are. I have 16 of them in my book, but there are more than this that are in scripture. But, you know, this idea of coming back to the land. But what is fascinating, what is absolutely fascinating, is that this idea of diaspora was not established in the covenant Yahweh made with Israel at Mount Sinai, or the covenant that he made on the plains of Moab before they came into the land. This idea of diaspora was founded when Jacob left Canaan and went to Laban's house and sought refuge there. And that is founded right there in the very beginning with the patriarchs, and something that still has implications for us in our future today. You know, we find with Jacob, and I did term this particular covenant with Jacob the diaspora covenant, because this idea of being spread to the east, south, north, and west totally encapsulates the idea of diaspora. And by the way, I love you guys' comments. These are wonderful. And I agree, it is happening now. And I think we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. There is so much good to come. And, you know, what seems to typify Jacob's life is this wrestling with God, this wrestling to do what is right. Doing what is right came easy for Abraham and for Isaac. Doing what is right does not come easy for Jacob. He really has to fight for it. He has to work at it until he finally gets it. You find in his later life, he really has prevailed in the way of Yahweh. He's made it. He's learned the lessons that came from pursuing ways that were not righteous. And then towards the end of his life, when there's the hope of restoration with Jacob, we find that Yahweh offers him a covenant of hope. And this to me is almost very personal, because the covenant of hope is that he would see the promises fulfilled. He would see Jacob alive in his day. And even though I did not write this in the book, I do almost feel as if this covenant speaks to our generation, where this covenant of hope is for us as well, where we will see these promises of the end of the diaspora. We are the generation that is waking up. We are seeing all of these promises being fulfilled. The nation of Israel reestablished, this land that was desolate, becoming a green field once again. We're seeing all of these promises coming to fruition in our day. And it's almost as if this covenant of hope speaks to us and promises that we will see this restoration in our day. And, you know, one thing too that I forgot, this idea of Jacob's ladder. And Jacob's ladder is a very important sign of the diaspora covenant. And in my book, I write that the sign of the diaspora covenant is this idea that there are covenants that progress up the ladder. And each covenant brings us one step closer to Yahweh and to knowing him. And each step brings us closer and closer until there is this covenant that we are able to make with Yahweh, because we have the heart, we have the soul, and we have the mind to follow his covenants and to walk in his ways. And so that we're able to fulfill all the previous covenants in this one covenant that will supersede, replace all the others, and that will define constitutional and religious ideas. So it will lead us into this land of uprightness. So that just to me was an incredible piece of information that I learned along the way, and something that I really enjoyed. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to go back. We still have, and I'm going to go about 10 minutes over tonight because I had trouble getting the video started because it worked differently on my home PC than what it did on my laptop. So we're going to go over by about 5 to 10 minutes. And I want to come back to the burnt offering covenant. So if you will, return with me to page 96 is where it's going to, I'm sorry, not 96, beginning on page 98. So with the burnt offering covenant, you know, Yahovah makes a big deal about Isaac being his firstborn son, Abraham's firstborn son, and also about Isaac being his only son. In Genesis 22, verse 2, Yahovah says, you know, take now your only son. So the only son that is recognized legally for Abraham is Isaac. Yahovah does the same thing with the nation of Israel. In Amos 3, verse 2, let me read to you what Amos says. Yahovah says this to Israel. He says, you only have I known of all the families of the earth. Therefore, in this case, I will punish you for your iniquities. But notice the concept here. God has established Israel as his only son. And in fact, in Exodus 4, verse 22, Yahovah states, Israel is my son, even my firstborn son. So you find this concept that Israel is Yahovah's, you know, only son in many ways, but really his firstborn son and his firstborn son among the nations. So there are parallels here with the sacrifice of Isaac and the nation of Israel. You know, a lot of theories have been proposed over the years as to the significance of Abraham offering Isaac as a burnt offering. And I think we have to really be grounded on the concepts of Torah, on the precepts of the law, because it's so easy to veer in a lot of different directions. You know, in the very beginning, we are told that this sacrifice or this burnt offering is a test. It is something that tempts Abraham to see if he will obey or not. We also find that Isaac is willingly bought. You know, everything in Scripture, the entire future of Abraham's lineage rests on Isaac. You know, I think that Abraham had enough knowledge of Yahovah. He had enough understanding of Yahovah to know the Creator would not violate his word. He knew that if he did, if he violated his word, if he went back on his promises, that Yahovah would have sinned and he could no longer be a righteous deity. I think Abraham really took that to the bank. He counted on that when he walked up those rock steps on Mount Moriah, and he bound Isaac, and he was willing to offer him as a sacrifice. Now we all know that the angel intervened, and that did not happen. But the symbolism that was established in that is monumental. And let me share with you why. If you will remember in Genesis 9:5 that we looked at last week, Yahovah established in his covenant with Noah, established this world judgment for all nations when they ate meat, blood of animals, with the blood in it. And when they fell into a lawless society where there was bloodshed, innocent bloodshed. So you find that this world judgment is reiterated again with the burnt offering covenant. And, you know, in Torah, one of the things that it states in Deuteronomy 25, verse 1, is that Yahovah does not sacrifice the wicked. I'm sorry, does not sacrifice the righteous. He says the wicked, you know, the righteous and the innocent you shall exonerate, but you shall condemn the wicked. So in this case, what did the sacrifice of Isaac represent? We find that the sacrifice of Isaac, specifically on Mount Moriah, which later becomes Jerusalem, because Mount Moriah, and you find in Chronicles that it specifically states that Mount Moriah is Jerusalem. This sacrifice of Isaac on Mount Moriah foretold of Israel's future Holocaust when they disobeyed the covenant, when they broke the covenant so egregiously that the laws of nature basically called out for justice. They called out for leveling the playing field and for accountability. So we find that, you know, because Abraham was willing to do this, because Abraham was willing to offer this, I mean, he knew that by obeying this command and walking up Mount Moriah and offering Isaac, he knew that when his descendants became wicked, that they would be shed, there would be bloodshed, that there would be lives lost, there would be heartache and sorrow. But he was willing to do it so that righteousness could prevail in the world, so that people would finally learn. And you know, there's this idea again of natural law, that when you go so far to one direction, the laws of nature just dictate that a consequence ensues, that something occurs that balances that weight. Because Abraham was willing to do this, Yahweh gave him the most incredible blessing of any covenant before or after. And not only does he reiterate all the previous covenants, but he then adds to it that Israel would own the gates of their enemies. So what does that mean? Owning an enemy's gate, and this was fulfilled during the monarchy in part, was that you would own a strategic trading point, a strategic point of entry, either out of your country and into another country's land. So we find that David had a strategic point during the monarchy, way up in north along the Euphrates River. But you find also that Israel, throughout their history, are promised to inherit and to own the strategic trading ports, the strategic highways with other nations. And you find that many of the European nations indeed did this for about 120 years until, you know, they abused their power and their power base fell as they failed to sanctify a code of standards and a value system and to hold themselves to constitutional values. So you find that they became weakened, and that weakening process is still occurring. But look at this promise for a latter-day restored Israel. You know, we think of Israel as the land between the Euphrates and the Nile, and it will be once again. But beyond that, Israel is still yet again promised to control the strategic and military entrances to their enemies' lands. And, you know, it may even be done willingly. What happens if Israel is the only one that can ensure peace in the Middle East or in Europe or in other places of the earth? It really changes the dynamic incredibly when you think of this in a restored nation and what this means for Israel's future. Just incredible hope and incredible joy of things, you know, what is it? Isaiah says, eyes have not seen nor ear heard the incredible things that Yahweh has in store for Israel. And I think that is just so much for us to hold on to, just such a joy and a delight. Now, let me catch some of these comments. Absolutely, Dave. You said a deal is a deal. Both sides must keep what they have promised. Absolutely. But, you know, and this is the thing that we learn about Yahweh. He is so generous, because when we keep that promise, he gives so much. When you look at what he gets in return, I mean, really, what can we give God? I mean, what does he need? What can he take from us? You know, are we going to beam something up to him? But you find that all he wants is our righteousness, our obedience. And when we do that, the blessings are just incredible. So that is just so heartwarming to see that, you know, unlike some other religions where you have a deity that is just very angry all the time and very wanting this concept of justice where it's very exacting. Yahweh isn't that way. He's very generous and he's very giving, and he gives so much in return. So, okay, Ken says, I thought Salem was Jerusalem. Yes, Salem was also Jerusalem. You know, in ancient cultures where you had land being taken over by different peoples at different point in time, you have different entities ruling. So Salem was probably more of the district in which Mount Moriah was in. because you find that at the Canaan conquest, Melchizedek's descendants are still ruling within the territory of Canaan. And Joshua, I believe, killed a couple of their Melchizedek's descendants at the era of the conquest. So even though it's Mount Moriah, it probably would have been in the district of Salem, which the same thing like with Hazor. You had the specific city of Hazor, but the territory of Hazor included a lot of different cities. So you can think of it perhaps as a capital for the region, but it was really a district administrative center. Okay, Elaine and Erwin say, what is the evidence from Torah that Abraham knew that God would not allow him to kill his son? One of the evidences that we have comes from something that Abraham said. And this comes from Genesis 22, verse 3, or actually, I think this is closer to verse 7, where Abraham says to Isaac, he says, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So there's this idea that Abraham acknowledged and he understood that Yahweh would in some way prevent the sacrifice of his son. He was willing. He was going to go with the game. He was going to show his obedience come what may. But he knew at some point in time that Yahweh would have to keep his word, or that God could not be a God of truth, because God can, if he fails to uphold his word. And again, if you look at chapter 1 and the definitions of truth, if God is not true and faithful to his own word, then he has sinned and he is no longer a righteous deity. So I think Abraham understood that, and that is why he was willing to go to such lengths to be tried and to be proved faithful in God's eyes. So any other questions? I'm going to just open this up for general discussion. I'd love seeing what you guys have to say. And this is a great way to spend Friday evening together. And let's see, I'm going to come back here. Okay, and Elaine says, but Abraham took his knife to kill his son. Yes, he did. And he was totally compliant. He was willing to kill Isaac. But I think he still understood that God would somehow intervene. I know there are differences of opinion on this, where some people say that Abraham did not believe that Yahweh would intervene. And that, I think that you can't discount that fact. But I do think that as a prophet, I do think that Abraham understood the prophetic implications of his act and what it would mean to his future descendants. I don't think we have enough information in the text to judge 100% one way or the other, as to whether Abraham knew for sure. To me, the comment that he makes to Isaac indicates that he understood Yahweh would intervene, but again, I think we have to leave it open for other opinions there as well. I know in the Seder Olam, it does state that after Abraham did this act, that shortly thereafter Sarah died, and that this was kind of some sort of judgment because Abraham was allowed to kill Isaac. I think you have to kind of, I would say, debunk or that idea, simply because the blessing that is given for obedience it's throughout Torah we find that if you are righteous, if you do what is right, there is a blessing. It is a good consequence. We find when you do evil or you disobey, there is a curse. So I don't find that Abraham disobeyed in any way, or that he did anything devious, because you find that the specific blessing is one of inheriting gates of the enemies, becoming extremely wealthy. So I do find that it was something that was viewed as good in God's sight. Okay, Ken says, but why would Yahweh ask him to do something he abhorred about other religions? Very, very good point. What comes through in the text, to me, the way I understand it, is that everything in Abraham's life was wrapped up around Isaac. So it was a test, perhaps, of fidelity. In his previous life. Okay, from Joy. All right, great, Joy. So, Joy, I do think that it was a test to see whether Abraham would obey. But again, what if Abraham understood the prophetic implications going into this? What if he understood that this sacrifice of Isaac wasn't, because he knew that history is repetitive, and whatever he did in his life would repeat in some fashion in successive generations. So if he understood that the precedent he was establishing on Mount Moriah, then I think that speaks, very strongly as to understanding his actions. Yes, and I think, there is a difference between the sacrifice of innocent children and the sacrifice of people that are just being slaughtered for sins. This was not a sin offering in the respect that he was sacrificing Isaac for any sin whatsoever. It was more of a test of fidelity and a test to see if this idea of sacrifice, if Abraham was allowed to do that within his children. Because, and here's why, in Israel's history, we find that Yahweh brings this concept into the rituals of the priesthood. He brings into the daily and this evening sacrifice the idea that if you disobey my covenants, this is the consequence. Every time you sin, you brought an animal as a sin offering to really just burn it in your mind that, hey, the consequence of me continuing on a path of rebellion, of me continuing to disregard and walking in a way that is unconstitutional will lead to a national breakdown of society where you have competing ideas, where you have competing factions, and that makes you very easily to be subjugated by your enemies. I think when you see those ideas at play and you see how it works in history and in society, you can see how it plays out. And for Israel, because they are sandwiched in this small portion of land and they have enemies on all of their sides, it's a very precarious position for them to need to obey the Constitution to have the protection. And again, you're right, absolutely, Stephen. It is a very deep passage to understand. I do not derive from this that Yahweh appreciates the sacrifice of innocent people or innocent children. I do not derive from this that he wants the sacrifice of anyone who's innocent. Rather, it's more that the sacrifice is established, or the symbolism, and not just the symbolism, but the prophecy is established that it will occur on Mount Moriah, again, which is later Jerusalem. So any other questions? And again, this is open for general comment, anything that you wanted to touch back on. Next week we will be meeting, but then we will be taking the 2nd of October off. We're going to take that off for Sukkot, and then we will come back again on the 9th. So any other thoughts or comments? I would really encourage everyone to read through this this chapter once or twice, because everything in Torah, every prophecy, every judgment, anything and everything that you see in Torah is founded on the patriarchal covenants. Nothing will contradict it. And what we find is that from the patriarchal covenants, next week we're going to start getting into some of the blessings. We're going to see how those blessings affected Jacob and his children and the future of Israel. So Joyce says, what was the wood for if he was not going to burn him? Very good question. We find that The wood is also used symbolically. And yes, the wood was there for a burnt offering. Isaac was placed on top of the wood, and he was thoroughly willing to obey. But remember, Ishmael had been disinherited. All of the promises had been given specifically to Abraham. So in my opinion, Abraham believed that at some point God would intervene and that he would not go through with it. But he did show himself faithful in every part of the test. But yes, and if you notice, I did entitle this particular covenant the burnt offering covenant. So the idea is that Abraham would slay him and then he would use him as a burnt offering. But it is this concept of burnt offering that the prophets use throughout history. And what you're going to see as we get into chapters 14, 15, and 16, and 17, this idea of a burnt offering that's established, that's mentioned, alluded to in the Noahic covenant, established here in the burnt offering covenant, and then reiterated again throughout all the prophets, it just really is brought home when you can see this thread. If you think of it as a tapestry and this prophecy that goes throughout, and you find again that this is always for Israel's sins. This is never for their righteousness. What is promised for their righteousness and obedience is always blessing. It's always the goodness of the earth. But with they breach the covenant, that is where the sacrifice occurs. And we will see that it is even mentioned. It is alluded to and it is mentioned in Deuteronomy 28 and 29. So you're going to, as we go on and as we continue on, you will see how these prophecies play out in Israel's histories throughout the words of the prophets. And Stephen says, for the ram he knew Yahweh would provide. And that's very true. He did state in the beginning that he knew Yahweh would provide a lamb for the burnt offering. So again, my position is that Abraham understood that God would intervene at some point in time. Again, there are definitely room for quite a few other positions and other opinions, and maybe one day we'll have the ability to ask that question personally. Close says, my take is that it was all about obedience and not because he delights in human sacrifice. Right. Human sacrifice. Joy says, ram and lamb are different. Why lay Isaac on the wood if that was not the purpose? Well, I think that, if you're showing yourself obedient, you're not going to you're not going to do the things that are required to show obedience. So a typical burnt offering of the day would be have a pile of stones. On top of the pile of stones, put your wood, and then on top of your wood, put your animal, which you would slay on the altar, and then you would burn it, in this case, as a whole burnt offering. And again, I think Abraham showed obedience. He showed that he was willing, and God again did intervene, and he stopped it. So yeah, you're fine, Joy. That was fine. So yeah, so the burnt offering is a very difficult chapter, but I think when we see, and this is something else that we will get into later on, that this idea of the Holocaust, of the Holocaust of Israel, of them being this whole burnt offering sacrifice, I show a lot of evidence from the prophets and from history that this day of judgment, this day of Yahweh, has already taken place. The sacrifice that for which the daily sacrifice represented, for which the sin offering sacrifice represented, all of that has been fulfilled in Israel's history. And so now when we look at go back and reread all of the 16 promises in this chapter for the restoration of Israel back to the land. When you follow those prophecies, and you look at it with the understanding that this sacrifice, this Holocaust, has already been fulfilled in Israel's history, and what for that is in their future is nothing but restoration, joy, obedience, and a burgeoning populace. That is such incredible, I mean, good news for Israel and for their future, and such hope and joy for the future to see that they've already paid the price. They've already, this retribution has already been exacted double. And again, we will come back to this in chapters 16 and 17 and 18. And we're going to look at this in greater detail. But I do encourage everyone to read this chapter a couple times, because it is very in depth. And then once you see these covenants running through Scripture and running through the words of the prophets, it's like it just becomes alive, because it's not as though, let me grab a drink of water here. It's not as though Joel or Amos or Micah are just pulling things out of a hat. When they speak, everything that they speak comes from a covenant, or it comes from the prior written words of some other prophet or the book of Psalms. So you're able to see these threads run very, very clearly and very succinctly. They're always based on rules and based on standards. And it becomes, Isaiah talks about, in that day, we shall not say every man know Yahweh, each man shall know him. And it really comes by understanding these constitutional covenants as they progress through Israel's history, and seeing how the prophets elaborate on them and add more information. So, any other questions or comments? So we'll give it another minute or two. And again, next week we get into the divided blessing, divided among the 12 sons of Israel. And we're going to see how that affects Israel's history, and how it later affects the covenant, the national covenant. And we're also going to see how that national covenant forms a constitution. Not totally the way Israel's constitution works today, but definitely the way ancient covenants worked at the time. So any other questions or comments? It has been a pleasure spending the evening with you all. And I have thoroughly enjoyed tonight. And I appreciate all of your comments, great discussions, and again, these are not easy questions to deal with, but it's great to have all of you here and join it together. And I hope I'll see most of you all tomorrow morning at Roots of Faith. Okay, next week we are going to read through page, let me look this up real quick. All right, we are reading through, I believe it's page 146. I will repost it on Facebook. I will repost the division of chapters on Facebook, but I believe we're going to go through page 123 to page 146. So it's basically 23 pages. So, all right. So, yes, Micah 7:18 through 20. Exactly. Let me look that up real quick, Paul. And I'm so glad you're able to make it. Great to have you with us. All right, I'm going to read what Paul had posted here. He says, "Who is a God like unto you, that pardons iniquity and passes by the transgression of the remnant of his heritage? He retains not his anger forever, because he delights in mercy. He will turn again. He will have compassion upon us. He will subdue our iniquities, and you will cast all their sins into the depths of the sea. You will perform truth to Jacob and the mercy to Abraham, which you have sworn to our fathers from the days of old. Oh, love that verse. Exactly. Exactly, Paul. Thanks so much, and great to have you all with us. Shabbat Shalom, and we will see you next week.